mic?
Yeah. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. It is 1 o'clock Friday afternoon, and I'll admit that this was not the optimal timing for me to have a workshop. I try to actually get work done on Friday afternoon. This is work though, right? So good afternoon. I'm Karen Mogus, Deputy Director, Division of Water Quality at the State Water Board and executive sponsor on the Toxicity Provisions Project, the rulemaking. And wanted to thank you all for coming. Many of you actually came a long ways. And I don't know how you LA people, if you've been out here to the Rancho Cordova office, but this is where I cut my teeth. This is like old home week here. So it's kind of cool. So welcome. I suppose we don't need to necessarily go around for introductions or anything. Just wanted to mention I've got my team here. There's the whole team is here. Right over in this area. We won't do introductions, but these are the guys working on the actual work. I'm just the talking head. And then Rebecca Fitzgerald back here, our standards chief, and Phil Wiles, our assistant chief counsel. I know, so I'm feeling like I want to walk around, but I have no control over anything if I walk around. So let's see, I think I have control. Au contraire, mon frère. All right. I was telling Phil that we should start with a song. I was actually singing to him a minute ago, but I think I'll spare you. Maybe if you stay after, we'll do some karaoke. Oh, really? Oh, well, let's go. All right. So today's workshop, I'm going to go over a few things. First is an overview of a new appendix that we're planning to add to the staff report. And we had hoped to have that appendix out for public review before this workshop and just did not get that out. So we're going to give you the preview and the timeline for hopefully getting it out for public review. And you'll have to endure yet another workshop because we're going to have one during the public comment period for that appendix. Just for what it's worth, we're also still looking at, we have not finished our round of board briefings post the workshop that we had in October. In fact, our last one is on Monday, and that will help us identify the proposed changes that we're going to make to the provisions, along with the discussion today, actually, on the option 4. And so we're going to then decide what, if any, of the rest of the provisions we'll be releasing for public comment along with the appendix. So hopefully that'll happen sometime in the middle of December, but just know that it may be beyond just the appendix for public comment. I'm going to give an overview of the scope of the Cerodaphnia study. For those of you who participated in the workshop in October, our board very much wanted us to explain, where are we going with the study and what is our intent. And so not that I've, scoped it out and got all the questions developed or anything like that, because we, of course, intend to do that as part of the stakeholder involvement in the study, but wanted to kind of give a sense of what we think the study is, what the study isn't, generally speaking, and move forward with that. And then we have what we have colloquially called Option 4, which was developed at the August 28th workshop that we had. And it's the discussion of what we plan to do with the Cereodaphnia. Well, it's one option that our board is considering for the Cereodaphnia test method while the study is being conducted. And so there were other options also discussed. This one I won't call a consensus option necessarily, but certainly one that was a compromise option that we came up with in August. And when we explained it to the board at the workshop, I'll admit I didn't do a great job of explaining it at the workshop. And we also identified additional scenarios that we would want to address in this interim period that we want to make sure you all have a chance to look at and provide any input or, wait a minute, that's not what we thought you were going to do, before we make some changes to the language and the provisions, assuming that that's the direction our board wants to go. So those are the topic areas. Hopefully it was exciting enough for you to make the trip out here. We'll see. You can let me know at the end if it was exciting enough. Okay, so starting with the appendix. The purpose of the appendix is to give us an opportunity to add some information to the record that we want to have included. There were some publications and internal memo that we asked for that we want to be able to refer to basically bolster our argument that they think the TST is an appropriate statistical approach. And then we also did some additional data analysis based on the comments that we received on the October 2018 version of the provisions and wanted to include those as well. So I'll go over what, just generally speaking, what we're planning to include, what you can expect to see. And again, this will be released for public comment for at least a 30-day public comment period. We recognize we're getting into the holiday season, and I don't want anybody reviewing this appendix on Christmas morning, and I certainly don't want to be responding to, well, these guys don't want to be responding to comments on Christmas morning, I'll say it that way. So it's likely to be more like a 45-day comment period somewhere into the end of January, depending on when we get it out, hopefully in December. So the publication I referred to was one put out by John Fox in published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2019, and basically looked at 8 California labs. Is that right? 8? Yeah, I'm looking over in this direction for confirmation. 8 California labs to just assess the within test variability that these labs would achieve, and whether the variability was in the range to achieve the 5% false positive rate. And the findings were that some of the labs that were assessed are achieving that within test variability or high test precision that would allow them to achieve the 5% false positive rate. Other labs need to improve their variability. The way too much, that's not the way I should put it. Too much variability to achieve the 5% false positive rate. So they either need to improve their implementation of the method to decrease their variability or increase the number of replicates that they use, or both actually could be done. And finally, the test of significant toxicity is a statistical approach that tends to incentivize labs to increase their test precision or decrease their variability. As opposed to the NOEC, where if you have a lot of variability, you're less likely to see differences between samples, and therefore decreasing your variability is not something you necessarily want to do, because if you're doing it for regulatory purposes, then that might end up in a violation. The second piece that we're including is a memo, also written by John Fox, where we basically asked him, okay, so we've got this 5% false positive rate that we've set, which is a typical statistical threshold for false positives for many types of statistical approaches, for many applications of statistics, right? We said, all right, so we've got this 5% false positive rate. Could you tell us what the likelihood of having a violation based on the framework we have for the monthly median effluent limitation, so our MMEL, in our current proposed version of the provisions, what's the likelihood of getting a violation based on false positives? And the answer is 1 in 500 chance. So pretty low. And then we said, all right, well, if that's the chance of having a violation, then we know that if you have more than one violation within a calendar month or more than one in 2 consecutive calendar months, then you have to do a toxicity reduction evaluation. So what's the likelihood of having the 2 violations based on false positives that would require then a TRE? And that's 1 in 1,000. So that's pretty low too. What were the likely? What are the things that it's just as likely to have a violation based on false positive as to be born with an extra digit? Is that right? So something like that. Just to make it fun. So that memo goes into, it's just basically calculations of, you know, if you have a 5% chance of having a false positive in 20 samples, what's your chance of having a violation with the first one being a fail and the next one or the third one being a fail? So that was basically the question we asked. And there's a short memo that describes the calculation to get there. So then I also mentioned we did some additional data analysis based on the comments that we received, and knowing that we had a number of facilities in the state that were required to conduct their data analysis using the TST, we pulled together what data was available to us to just kind of see what is the data telling us. So we looked at 10 facilities that out of the LA Regional Board, and I looked at about just under 600 Stereodaphnia dubia reproduction chronic TST test results, and found that the TST is doing what we expect it to do. We found no fails below 10% effect, and the labs that are conducting tests for facilities that are, we've also found that those that are using the TST, their variability is decreasing over time. The test precision is increasing, and that's both from, I believe, well, I don't know if we can really say it's from improved method implementation, although we can probably presume that. But also many of these have increased the replication in their tests. And so this is what it looks like. These are, this is a bar graph of the results of the 586. Oh, so this is just under 400 test results. And basically it shows us that under 10%, most of the tests actually pass. 294 out of the 398 results had less than 10% effect, and they all passed. We had no fails below 10%, which makes sense, right? We set the regulatory management decision at 10% effect, and we did not want to have any false positives at greater than 5% of the time below a 10% effect. So we're not seeing it at all. Between 10 and 25%, most of the tests that fell within that range were passes, with the exception of nine of them, which also makes a lot of sense because we also set the upper bound of the regulatory management decision at 25%. So where we really set the bar at what we care about in terms of toxicity was at 25%, knowing that between 10 and 25, there are going to be fails, and there's a number of reasons why that might occur. But we don't see very many fails in that range. And then above 25%, when we saw there were 36 samples that had a percent effect above 25%, and there were all fails. I mean, yes, all fails and no passes. So basically, it's the TST is doing what it was designed to do based on the results that we're seeing from actual laboratories. This is not fake data. This is what we see. And so we're adding this to the appendix to just basically support the approach of the TST. Of course. So those fails are toxicity. Oh, yes, thank you.
Loudly in the microphone, but not that loudly, or else your voice won't be recorded.
So my question was, the proposal had been to set reasonable potential at 10% when you're not seeing fails below that, but you are seeing potentially fails in between, but that may or may not be toxicity.
We're not saying that they may or may not be toxicity. We're calling those samples toxic. Those 9 samples.
But they're below your regulatory management decision.
They are a fail of the TST and therefore toxic.
But if the TST is defined as being 25% or above for limits, for the limits.
I'm not sure what you mean for the limits.
Because you've set it as a fail plus a 25% effect.
We set it as a fail of the TST. The TST actually has incorporated into it the 25% effect, and you can have a fail below 25% if you have, if you happen to have, it depends on your laboratory performance. It depends on the lab control performance, that is. It depends on the variability in the lab control and the variability in the effluent sample. So you can have a sample that has a fail of the TST below 25% under certain circumstances, rarely, but under certain circumstances, and we call that a fail and a toxic sample. Well, that's true. The NOAC can also show a fail between 10 and 25%. So it's no different than what is being done now. You mean at a single concentration? Is that what you mean? It doesn't have a pass-fail? Because the NOAC is the no observable effect concentration. So it really is a pass-fail at whatever the concentration is that shows a statistical difference. So you're right, it's not a pass-fail at a single concentration. It could be any of the dilutions that are, the NOAC could be any of the dilutions that are tested, but it has to be one of the dilutions that's tested. So, okay. Were there other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. How does what is the definition you're using of a false positive for this analysis?
We have, I'll say there are 2 ways that we are defining false positive. The TST had to set a boundary at the lower end of what we consider toxic, and so that was set at 10%. So a false positive, the rate of 5% false positives is defined in the context of the TST as any fail below 10%. Now, there's also statistical false positives that can be assessed on a population of tests, a large data set, and that's also 5% of the time. So there can be those 9 that are the fails between 10 and 25%. If you looked at the population, there could be that one of those is a false positive, but you can't know that for any one test. You can't say, oh, that was toxic and that's a false positive. There's no way of saying that. But we do call fails below the 10% a false positive. And we don't want to see them, and we don't. Does that help?
Yes, I was thinking in terms of
Confusing.
whole effluent toxicity testing. The answer to the question of whether or not you're adversely affecting beneficial uses is determined not relative to like a numeric threshold or a standard, but using the comparison to a control. And a different definition, which wasn't spoken of, would be one at which multiple labs agreeing on the same answer, which is different than a statistical analysis.
So that is
Yes.
not what we're calling a false positive.
Correct. That's what I was asking.
That's a blank sample that one lab considers toxic, and it shouldn't be. And so that's a different issue altogether, and we are not calling that a false positive. Make sense? Okay. So false positive, all about statistics, not about lab variability among labs. Thank you. Other questions? Yes, Steve. I'll give you my mic.
Hello? Whoa.
Hello.
All right. Everybody's going to have to learn to use the
Okay,
mic today.
Maybe you have to sing your question. That's what
not
we
going
should
to
do.
happen.
That's
I
what
can
we should
assure
do.
you of
Sing
that.
the
This voice is
questions.
not a singing voice. So the previous slide to this, you noted there were 589 tests, and yet the slide, and it was of labs in California, I thought, were
Yes.
noted. And then this slide is a smaller subset.
Yeah.
Is there any reason why you dropped about almost 200 tests and didn't include those in this slide?
This was just an example that the full data set shows the same thing, basically. But we just threw this slide in here to just demonstrate. But yeah, you're right. The appendix will include the full data set that we looked at.
Hello, Stephen. So the reason why is 2 of the facilities are City of LA, and they use a different lab. So in the appendix, there's a previous discussion about how Fox presents their results. We actually did additional data analysis by staff on lab variability as well. And that's presented, and we present information on LACSD's municipal lab. And then, so therefore, we wanted to show the results, so that ties in, but that we also show the City of LA as well. City of LA doesn't specify their lab, so we wanted to separate the wet results because we have a discussion specifically about LACSD, long-term CV values. All those graphs are in
The appendix.
Yeah, so Karen presented the summary statistic in the bullet slide, but we have we present all that to you. And in all honesty, it's really, the 2 facilities for the City of LA are even tighter. There's like 1 fail out of 50 tests. Nothing below 10%.
I'll be Hugh Donahue. Hugh Donahue? What the hell? Phil Donahue.
Yeah, Phil Donahue. Obviously, this is our lab's data, and I will concur with the results. And one of the things, we're talking about false positives, but there's another term I would call false determinations of toxicity, which I think is very different than a false positive error. Because what you described as a false positive error is exactly what a false positive error is. It's a statistical measure. But what is pretty apparent is one of the things that our lab has struggled with, and that is when you have effects less than 20%, there are things you can do from a variability, test control, increased replication. In our laboratory, I commend them, have done quite a bit of work, and as you can see, you know, the vast majority of those were actually deemed to be passing the TST. It's when you get to effects greater than 20% that those kind of procedures really start to fail. You're pretty much, and of course, we're calling 80% or more of the samples with a greater than a 20% effect as a fail. So it's not rare when you're above a 20%, right? 8 out of the 10 times we saw that, we called it a fail. But one of the things that when using blank samples, and so I do agree with you, there are things you can do and things we have done to improve the statistical false positive error rate when your effects are less than 20. But it's when you have a non-toxic sample that has an effect greater than 20%. And when we get to what's going to be coming up next, I think that's a critical component of the study, is evaluating why that happens and how to control that, how we can control seeing relatively large effects in what we know to be non-toxic samples. Because I do agree with you, if you see an effect of less than 20% in a non-toxic sample, you can do some things to try to control that from calling that as a fail. And you've demonstrated that quite well here.
Thank you. Other questions? I'm faster than they are.
I'll try not to yell in it. Can you hear me? Oh, I was just going to point out too. I'm assuming this is mostly then the freshwater species data in the city of LA. It's all Ceradaphnia. Okay. Okay. It's just Ceradaphnia. Okay, I was just curious if there was other species mixed in there and that kind of thing. Oh, okay. Cool.
All Ceradaphnia, all,
right.
well, the reproduction and survival endpoints are mixed with TSP.
Got it.
But the
Yeah,
driver was, all Ceria. Yeah.
Phil, maybe you can answer this, but you mentioned, and Karen mentioned, added replication is one of the things that's done. Is that what you're referring to, Phil, when you say that your lab was able to do better in the less than 20%?
The things that the lab has incorporated, but they have taken some very, very extra efforts in training and culturing and so it went beyond that to try to achieve these kinds of results. But that was definitely one of the things.
And is that captured in your guys' staff report? What okay, awesome.
And it's actually captured in the original staff report, not just the appendix. That increased replication can improve precision. Oh, you mean in what we? Yes, I believe so. When we talk about variability within the lab, we include the fact that in some cases they've increased replication.
Yeah, I mean, so Stephen's probably going to jump in. There's two. We talk about increasing your statistical power, right, and your confidence. There's two ways to do that. One is to reduce your within lab or within test variability. The second one is to increase your replicates. Increasing your replicates doesn't increase your precision. Together, they provide greater statistical power. So, and Phil's very right. I mean, LA CSD Municipal Lab has done a really good job in the data we show over multiple years. They've really gotten increased precision. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we include the probability. We add because the Fox memo, if you look at it, includes replicates in its probability curves, and we include that. So in a way, LA County has gotten really good, and then on top of that, they actually have additional replicates. It really increases their statistical power.
And we've included that in the appendix. Yeah. Okay, that was the question.
Karen, so one more little piece on that is including in the appendix collectively, as Phil said, it is one thing, but have you parsed out, especially in that example of those 10 tests between 20 and 25%, I'm assuming all of those, Phil, had double the replicates in the control. Yeah. So, I mean, it would be nice if you had data sets for which 10 reps were done and then changes to 20 reps were done to see the influence of increased replication. I mean, I know it's going to be variable by laboratory, but the extra effort, I think this is what Tom might have been getting at too, is that extra effort at between 20 and 25% very unlikely in terms of replication, to result in an improved outcome of reduced findings of toxicity with the TST. I'm not sure if you have sufficient data to.
Well, the goal it's to be more confident in the result. The goal is not to reduce the number of times we see toxicity.
For a
We
discharger.
want to be confident when we see toxicity that the answer is an accurate answer. And so the lower the variability, the more confident we are in the answer.
I understand confidence but from a discharger's perspective, when they're operating in that, if they're in that 20 to 25%, what they're going to be seeking to do, in fact, the early TST documents suggested to increase replication and refine your laboratory procedures. So one of the things the dischargers are going to be expecting of their laboratories is what can you do to improve the probability of when you're less than 25%, of determining the sample is toxic based upon procedural issues with a method. So that's what I'm getting at in terms of reducing the probabilities of finding a sample is toxic by procedural protocols. So.
You need to look at, it's complex statistics. As you approach that 25% effect, your probabilities increase for both the NOAC and the TST. That's just statistics. It's not a jump from the 10% to the 25. And so the reality with your cloud of data of replicates, you're getting close to that 25. You really don't know if you're above 25 or below 25. That's why you see an increase from 20 to 25. You're going to see that with NOAC as well as with TST. That's just statistics. And it's that 10% that we said was unacceptable toxicity. But as you approach the 25, your probabilities go up for any of the statistical methods. And so that's just the fact of statistics.
At the end of the day, again, via the encouragement in the TST EPA document, as well as what's come from the State Water Board, dischargers are going to be seeking to give instructions to their laboratories to refine protocol and improve precision as much as possible. And they're going to be seeking to try to balance where those cost trade-offs occur. Increase replication, increase effort and cost, right, Phil? So that's kind of where I'm trying to get at that. I understand all the statistics, and you probably don't have a big enough data set to determine, in 10 of 400 tests, when your tipping point is, if you've refined your protocols, that the extra replicates help or don't, is what I was asking.
Yeah, and that wasn't the intent of our data evaluation either. So that wasn't included.
Okay, let's start with the question I have for you. Way towards the beginning, last time in October, you had said that you were going to provide the Fox et al. Paper itself. Has that been, I didn't see it posted. Has that? Well, team report. Oh, okay. I've looked for it. I don't. Okay, that would be great. Okay, so this is kind of a question for probably LACSD, is that when they did the replicates, how much did they do? And was it only on the controls or was it on everything?
Don't start talking yet.
You should make us all go up to the front, and then maybe we'll ask fewer questions. We doubled the replicates, not for everything.
10 to 20.
Well, with the control in the IWC, the critical concentration. Not because we thought that, we haven't done the analysis. We may have maybe only needed to increase it by 50% instead of 100%. We didn't do that analysis, but just the way our systems were set up in groups of 10, it just was functionally to double it than to do 50% more. So, but yes, we doubled it at the control in the IWC.
This is fun stuff, Joe's.
Yeah, when you're doing the replicates, it's from the same bucket. You pour it 10 times to 20 times, not from 10 different samples pulled from the same sampling point, correct?
Take one sample and you split it into replicates, right? You don't go collect 10 samples or 20. Yeah. So in the end, these methods are all what you would call pseudo replication, actually. Yeah. Do you want us to start requiring 10 samples, one for every replicate? Somebody note that? Oh, just kidding.
What I'm saying is that because it's not a true replication, the variability will be lower if it's from the same sample bucket. But if it's from 10 different buckets from the same sampling point, that will represent true replications.
So does anyone in the room collect 10 samples, one for each replicate of their toxicity test? Didn't think so. Yeah. Yeah, no, I understand. And it is definitely a shortcoming, I guess. Other questions? So Phil, you need to have a workshop. Okay, so this is just a couple of slides on the study that we're planning to conduct and to kind of give a better sense of what we intend to do, what the study is, what it is not. And so the need for this study is that we have a number of labs. We've already talked about the Fox findings that are able to achieve the variability that's necessary to achieve the 5% or less false positive rate. And then others have higher variability and should reduce their variability in some way. We also, this has also been mentioned in a number of comments already, that there are issues with both split samples, whether they're lab controls or test samples, that are not, the results from different laboratories aren't always consistent. And the study or report that always gets referred to is the Southern California Stormwater Monitoring Coalition's intercalibration study that they had done and showed that there were lab controls in which were sent to multiple laboratories, and some actually indicated they were toxic samples. So those are the issues that have arisen, and want to make sure that we address, at least in some fashion, each of those issues. So our objective is to conduct a study to identify ways that we can help laboratories improve their implementation of the Ceredaphnia reproduction method to reduce within laboratory variability. And there can be a number of ways that that could be done. Sounds like LA County has some ways that they can offer, and I look forward to hearing about those more. And then improve consistency between laboratories to the degree that we can achieve that. What the study is not is to study whether or not the Ceredaphnia reproduction test is appropriate for use in California. That is not one of the questions that we will be answering. I have said a number of times that we are not planning to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that this test is a good test, has been used for lots of identifying toxicity in the state and reducing it within our regulatory programs. And so we're not proposing that we're going to throw out Ceredaphnia at the end of this study. It is not a study of the false positive rate. That is something that is a statistical analysis that's huge. It's a way bigger study than we collectively have the funds to do, and don't intend to do it because it's been done. And we've set the false positive rate based on a pretty robust analysis of the data. And it's not a study to establish an accuracy benchmark based on a standard. So method-defined analytes like toxicity don't have standards like chemistry analytes do. So in other words, you can't have a standard for toxicity. You could use a chemical, and that's what you'd use for the DMR-QA analysis, that if you are conducting toxicity testing for any major discharger in the state, you probably participate in that. but it's not like taking a copper sample and testing it against a standard copper sample, because of the issue of having the lab control comparison to the test sample is really what defines whether a sample is toxic or not. So here's what we plan to do. We want to evaluate variability within and among labs. And so we're going to conduct rounds of testing the same samples. So they may be samples that are toxic and some that are non-toxic blanks, with an initial round evaluating the results from the various labs. We're hoping to include as many labs that are accredited to do this in the state as possible, so we can cast a wide net and hopefully, where needed, improve the lab implementation so that anyone can use a lab that's accredited in the state and feel confident about the results that they're getting. And so we'll do the first round, we'll evaluate the results. We'll probably do a lot of actually evaluating control charts and SOPs and things that are, the kinds of things that the lab accreditation program comes out and looks at, with an eye toward, okay, what is this lab doing that might be different from this lab, or this lab different from this other set of labs? So, and with the eye toward improving, not calling them out and shutting them down. That's not the plan at all. So again, evaluating historical performance, ref tox results, control charts, CVs, those kinds of things. Standard operating procedures, lab protocols, training protocols, those kinds of things. And then evaluating also areas in the method that allow for flexibility that might be wildly different between labs. So how the lab control is formulated, how the feeding is formulated, the food, as well as how the feeding is conducted. There are some flexibilities in the method that, if we tighten it up for implementation in California, could improve the variability among labs. So we plan to contract with SWRCB to facilitate and manage the study. We also want to include some external experts to give us advice, as well as a stakeholder advisory group that will include labs, it'll include the regulated community, so permittees, NGOs, lab accreditation program, LTAC, and US EPA, and provide access to data from peer-reviewed studies and existing lab data, and coordinate the writing and submission of the findings, and then ultimately present those findings to the state board. So yes, you have a question.
Okay, in regards to the second bullet, many times expert panels that are brought together for state processes are exclusively from academia. And there are a lot of experts that have more experience than academic labs in the nation as it relates to Ceria daphne. So I would encourage the State Water Board to reach out to CTAC, Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. They take a tripartite approach: academia, industry/consultancy, and then what's the third one? Regulated parties. Thank you. I'm sorry. Yeah. And I can assure you that outside of California, there are people that are 40 years of experience with this subject matter. And I encourage that to be kind of the framework rather than an academic-only expert panel.
Yeah. We say academic only? Okay, no. Okay, good. Yeah, the intent is not, and in fact, we have convened many expert panels for a lot of subjects that don't just include academia. And I agree, there's many laboratories and experts in implementation that are regulated facility laboratories that have expertise. So, and in fact, our hope is to vet the list of expert panelists with the stakeholders ahead of actually assigning them. So we'll actually be looking to you all for some recommendations as well. Questions? Yes, Josie has a question.
On previous slide, you mentioned that you hope to tighten up the method for implementation. So I take it at the end, or including in the findings, will be a recommendation on how to improve the method. Or
I'll be clear. When you say improve the method, that sounds like we're going to change the method. And so the idea is to look at the areas where there's flexibility and maybe not allow as much flexibility in certain areas. That's a possibility. I don't know if that's going to be a finding, but it could be.
Thank you. So you noted that one of the things you're not going to be doing is the false positive rate. Are you going to be giving consideration to determining the rate at which there's false determination of toxicity in blank samples?
Yeah, that'll be part of the study. Will be, and I don't know if we can really call it a rate if we have 20 labs and 2 sets of samples. So we'll have to think about what findings we can make based on our study design. But yes, we will be looking at splitting samples, both toxic and non-toxic, and looking at the results.
Okay, and then I'm wondering if in this study you're going to be looking at, what's the right term for it, the ionic strength of the sample? There's a term we use, conductivity,
So the issue of
ionic balance in your balance.
Yeah.
Because we're noting there are new facilities coming online with more push to more potable water reuse, say, where there are effluents coming out of RO facilities that are going to have a different ionic strength than you would typically encounter. And I know that the Daphne are very sensitive to that. So I don't know if that's going to be something that's also going to be included or thought about in this.
Yeah, there's a lot of publications along those lines, and so it's not something that we can ignore. And so certainly would be something we would need to collect data on, right, as part of the study. So that would be a factor that we would need to evaluate when we see wildly different results, right? Other questions on the study? Because I think that's the best slide. The money. No, go ahead.
So just to add to the comments about low hardness, low ions, that is an issue that I know USGS and EPA are looking into at their national labs. We've been seeing it here, and I don't know if it's well published because most of the ion toxicity work has been looking at the excess end. So, but yeah, I'm glad to hear that it will be something that's considered or at least not ignored.
Not ignored. Any other questions? Oh, Josh.
Let me try. Obviously, if we look back at the CASA white paper, it's out there that there's a lot of concern among the regulated entities about, we're just using generic terms here, the reliability of the test and these false determinations of toxicity. And I completely understand what you said about that this study may not have the resources in terms of lab capacity to really get at this sort of an error rate, we'll call it here. But the nice thing, if we can push for something like that, is if we can't come up with a methodological or a technical solution for improvements, then we would at least be able to come up with an implementation process, whether we call it 3 out of 4 tests or something like that, to balance things out through implementation as opposed to technically. If that made sense.
Well, I guess, how about save the concept for our discussions when we're designing the study, but I'm not sure what you mean by implementation and 3 out of 4 tests, and because what we're talking about when we're talking about the false determinations of toxicity are split samples among labs. And so you've got a lab control coming from lab A and sent over to lab B, who uses a different lab control. It's conceivable that lab B's Daphne aren't going to like that new lab control very much and show toxicity. So when you're talking about 3 out of 4 samples, 3 out of 4 split samples, see what I mean? Like
No, absolutely. I meant, sorry, 3 out of 4. If let's just say hypothetically, we're saying that there's a 5% false positive error rate, and so using the monthly median approach with 2 out of 3 tests reduces the probability even further of coming up with a violation. And so if there's a study that comes out and says that no, there's actually, make up numbers here, a 10% false determination of toxicity rate, then maybe it's instead of 2 tests out of 3 being a failure, it's a 3 out of 4 tests. It just becomes a mathematical problem via implementation.
So I don't think we have the resources to do what, to have a rate of numbers of false positive in this context of this study. That's a lot of samples.
It is. That's a lot of what the regulated community is concerned about.
All right, well, that leads me to my next slide, which is this was all intended to be a study that's jointly funded and jointly conducted. And we estimate that it's around a $2 million study, all told, with the facilitation of the stakeholder groups, having the meetings, convening the panel, doing all of the testing. Now that's $2 million that may include in-kind. And so if you're a laboratory sitting in this room and want to participate in the study and are willing to provide your services in kind, that would be fabulous. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand today, but you will be getting phone calls. And if you are a facility that has your own lab or an additional budget that you could contribute to some of the facilitation costs, please consider that as well. We're actually looking into the amount that, just know that State Board is willing to also pony up, and we're looking at the budget numbers for the amount that it costs for all of the facilitation and sort of the organization parts of it, and seeing what we can support for that part of it, but the lab costs and things are a significant piece. So be thinking of that. Again, we're going to attempt to involve as many labs that are accredited to do the method in the state as possible. We identified how many labs for Stereo. It's actually like 10 or 12. So it's not that many labs. So that would be exciting to get everybody involved. And, you know, even improving some labs by getting them connected up with labs who are doing a really good job. So I'm super excited about this, actually. And just really quick before I open it up for questions. So we've noted a number of times that we had to have a date certain in our provisions by which we get this study done, and we go back to implementing the provisions as they're written. And so our proposal is 2023. We do think we can get the study rolling with a kickoff early in 2020. And complete the testing necessary. It's going to be a challenge with, I mean, I've been in many of these panels, and it's difficult to get stakeholders together. It's not a trivial thing to get something like this done in 3 years, but that's our plan. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One is in regards to the funding. So it's going to be a possibility of a jointly funded project with some in-kind contributions from parties. Have you guys already spoken to enough parties to feel comfortable you've got those funds secured? No. Okay, so there's no guarantee this is going to happen, but I think everybody would like to see it happen. And then yep. And then 2, you're right in terms of the numbers of laboratories in California that are accredited for chronic Daphnia tests. There are laboratories that are accredited in California but are not resident in California. So make sure I'd encourage you guys to reach out. Good, because that would cast potentially a broader pool of parties to participate so you get your sample size up.
Other questions?
Can you expound a little bit on your, you said kickoff, but I just was, on your time frame that you're looking for, especially as you're talking about getting money, getting this started, getting the scope done, so that's going to, that shows how you get to that 2023 deadline.
I want all those details all laid out right this minute. Okay, so a major milestone is we have a kickoff meeting in January or February, probably more likely February. At that point, we're starting to design the study. We're going to have to identify expert panelists. You know, there's going to be a lot to do at that kickoff. It's probably a 2-day meeting, I would imagine. I'm not sure. From there, I think we need to start sending samples around by next summer, next fall at the latest, and start that initial round. The initial round has to be done next year at some point, I think. And then from there, we do the date. I mean, I'm totally doing this off the top of my head, so don't call this gospel, please. But all I'm saying is to get to 2023, we got to get on the stick. So, you know, we got to get going. Data analysis of that first round, looking at historical information, SOPs, those kinds of things. It's going to take some work at the labs. It's going to take some work at the for SWRCB and for our facilities. We're all going to have to roll up our sleeves and get this done. So second round somewhere in 2021, mid-2021-ish maybe. And then from there, well, and so between the time of the first round and the second round, there's a lot of information gathering and interviewing labs and looking at their data and then identifying what are some of the things we think could be modified in these labs or all the labs, or who knows what that first round is going to result in, right? And then the second round is to implement those things, right? And see, did it work? Were we able to get people more in agreement? Were we able to increase, decrease variability among the labs? Or not among the labs? Yes, among, part of it among, and part of it within. And then go, okay, well, these things worked, or they didn't work, or, there's going to need to be an analysis at the end with some ultimate findings to recommend to ELAP. And I'm not sure what the ultimate endpoint will be. I guess it depends on what the findings are. And then a report back out, and we have committed to our board that we would also report back out to them once the study's done. So yeah, I think 2023 is doable and yet a bit ambitious. Yeah.
I'm assuming you're going to use the expert panel to help weigh in on the study design as well, or be, be an integral part of that.
Oh yeah.
Okay, because we had impaneled some experts not too long ago through CASA, and the number of samples that they thought it would take to actually, estimate that number was not terribly high. It was surprisingly, it was less than 100. But that your expert panel might have a different opinion or whatever. But if it might be something they might want to weigh in on. The other thing too, I think, because obviously you're going to be passing the hat on this, we'd want to know how the information, how the State Water Board intends to use this information in terms of how it might address the toxicity provisions. Specifically, if results come back something like the Stormwater Monitoring Coalition study, and I'm not saying they will, but let's say they do, and we spend $2 million to try to fix it, and there's nothing we can do. What, and the second or third round of testing says, yeah, 50% of blank samples are going to be called toxic. We just got to live with it. How are you going to respond, for various things? If you come up with a guidance document that fixes it, is it going to be something that would be allowed through ELAP? Some sort of assurances that this will end up being money that will be well spent and well used and affect decent change.
Well, I mean, I'm going to have to tell you, you got to go on faith a little bit. I can't predict what the findings are going to be. And so I can tell you what our intent is. Our intent is to improve implementation of the method so we get variability low and we have as little as, let me put it this way, as good agreement among labs as we can achieve. What that ultimately means in terms of our response to those findings depends on the findings. So you're trying to get me to predict the future. I wish I could do that. I probably wouldn't have this job.
Oh, just to expand on the study thought as well, I think this is an awesome opportunity to think about answering those questions that we know are out there already. The water hardness issues, the ion makeup, and the fact that you have cultures that are in a certain water and you're putting the Daphne into a water that might be very different. And maybe we can look at the range of those waters and bring that kind of context into this study to try to answer those questions. Because if we know what's causing a change in the reproduction in our controls versus our sample, we'll have a better idea of how to implement that. Is that using receiving water, to actually culture Daphnia for a particular discharge? Maybe there's guidance that can be put in there that the EPA methods allow, flexibility with. So if we, have ideas and guidance on how we're culturing and how we're feeding, doing all that kind of stuff, I just see this opportunity of this study as helping along those lines. So not just looking at it as an intercalibration study, but trying to actually bring in some questions technically that we want to answer. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think this is an exciting opportunity to get together and work together and see what we can come up with. Yeah, Josie.
If at the end of the study it shows that perhaps the limit that you set forward today is too low, will you be flexible enough to change it based on the study?
So you're asking me if the effluent limitations are too low? The 5%? Right, you're asking me to change the TST. That would be the result. That's right. The regulatory management decisions are incorporated into the TST. So the answer is no. I don't think that's the question we're asking with the study, is whether or not 10% and 25% are appropriate for TST. So.
But the study could produce some information that could suggest that all this variability should be incorporated with your evaluation, and therefore, the percent effect that you set forward is.
I'm sorry, Jacob, can you give her a microphone so that the
Sorry.
video can hear? Thanks.
Understood. Sorry. Well, what I'm saying is, if the result of the study identify that there is enough variability that should be incorporated on top of what the provision is stated as of today, will you be flexible enough to incorporate that and allow for that?
I think we've shown in a couple of analyses that the average variability both is achievable and among labs that are accredited, I don't know about nationwide, but certainly it's achievable, it's doable. So if some labs can do it, then I don't see why other labs can't achieve it. So I'm going to say no. We're not recreating a new statistical method, and NOAC has the same issue. It's just flipped, right? So I think there's a lot of improvement here and a lot of opportunity for us to improve implementation of the stereo method in the state. So, is anyone recording this? You guys are trying to get me to say stuff, and I'm not going to say it.
So the question I have, or something for most people to look at, whether you're looking at the Stormwater Monitoring Coalition, the blank data from that, or the EPA study from 2002, which is very, very old, or whatever. The lion's share of the issue wasn't laboratories identifying non-toxic blank samples with less than a 20% effect as toxic with the TST. That wasn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem were blank samples that exhibited effects greater than 20%, and sometimes extremely high, like 50 and 70 and 80% effects. And it's going to be, you know, when I look at the the studies that incorporated blanks up to this point, to me, that is the one thing that's most concerning. Now, it's easy for me to say because LA County Sanitation District has taken a lot of steps and spent a lot of money to address that issue of tests that exhibit less than a 20% effect, you know, not being identified as a fail with the TST. But once again, if you look at the blank data, the vast majority of those cases were not laboratory variability problems within laboratory variability problems. They were, the laboratories actually, the test exhibited extremely high effects that would have been toxic, you know, by definition with the TST. So I hope that that's something, you know, that is at least a big focus of this special study. It certainly would need to be for us to really strongly support it, because that's where I see the biggest problem, potential problem at least is, and try to figure out why that is, and if there's things we can do with secondary controls that mimic the effluent. I don't think it's an unsolvable problem. I don't want it to be ignored, and in fact, I want it to be probably, and obviously we'll talk to the expert panel when they come out.
So we're not going to ignore it, and my board expects me to address it, because I don't disagree with you. That's a problem. And we can't have the notion that we're splitting samples among, just for what it's worth though, nobody's talking about split samples in chemistry, and there's just as big a problem with differences in chemistry among laboratories as there is with toxicity. Okay. That's true. That's true. That's true. So yes, it is not going to be ignored.
I mean, I think riding on to Phil's point a little bit, the principal component of it should be looking at the practices from the lab side. I mean, the ion imbalance problem, you know, not just the typical high or low conductivity. I mean, we run into it when we're doing TIEs and when we're doing evaluations that, you know, one of the biggest, and we participated very heavily in the SMC study, both in the planning phase and going through it. I think I agree that the blank samples turning out there had huge effects. And, you know, I think looking at whether it's culturing practices or how organisms are exposed to different water types, I think is a huge part of it. And I hope that, you know, in incorporating some of the blanks, we look at both laboratory made waters against natural receiving waters that are known to be non-toxic to the extent that you can find that, because I think that's going to be an interesting point going forward, because that's, you know, when we see different culture waters being brought in, and when we have to culture cereals in different waters for specific tests or specific studies, it certainly takes them a little while when they're not in what they love. So on the side of that, I'm very excited about the study as well. I think it's going to be really interesting.
Sounds like our kickoff meeting is going to be quite robust. Couple of days, I'm sure. Yeah, really. Make it a retreat. We can do it at Grunleybakken or something, right? Yeah. We'll lock you in a room. Just give you bread and water. No alcohol. Wait a minute. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions on the study? Because this is my last slide on the study, and we're going to move on to option 4. All right, let's do it. So this is a little reminder of the options that we were discussing back in August, which are options 1, 2, and 3, and then we added number 4 during the workshop. So option 1 was no change. Use Ceredaphnia to assess compliance with effluent limitations per the draft provisions from the October and then July 2019 versions. Option 2 was to just use Ceredaphnia as a monitoring trigger and then use the second most sensitive species for compliance with effluent limitations. And of course that requires more testing, so that's not one that folks were too excited about. And then the third is don't use C. dubia for monitoring at all. Don't do it, don't use it, throw it out until we get this study done. Option 4, again, was one that we devised during the workshop, and it was to delay inclusion of the monthly median effluent limitation for Cereodaphnia and permits that don't currently have numeric effluent limits until a future date. So what that looks like are a number of scenarios that we have now hopefully, sorry, there was another, well, I'll get to the scenarios in a second. So, so that question is, you know, what do we do in the interim while the study's going on? And again, our board has not decided on this, just so you know. This should not be considered the decision of the board. What they asked us to do in October was to go back and talk to the stakeholders and make sure that they understand what exactly all the elements of this option are. So that's what we're doing today. So just making sure that you're clear that this is not a foregone conclusion. And so what happens to the use of Cereodaphnia during the interim period? So after the effective date of the provisions, dischargers will continue to comply with their current permit requirements until they are renewed, reissued, or reopened. So if you already have effluent limitations for toxicity based on Cereodaphnia, you will continue to comply with those effluent limitations. If you do not, then you would continue to comply with whatever's in your permit now anyway. And in fact, if we were to go with option 1, that would still be the case, because our plan is not to have any of this be applied to any permits until they are reissued. We're not requiring regional boards to reopen permits to incorporate the provisions. So that would have happened anyway. So, and then for permits that are renewed, reissued, or reopened during this interim period, that's where you have the sticking point and all these scenarios of things that might happen. What do we do? And so we're going to go through those scenarios now.
Hey, Karen.
Yes, where am I talking?
I'm over here. Hey.
Whoa, hello.
Just for the people on the webcast, can you speak just a little louder into the microphone?
Okay.
Perfect.
Oh my
Thank
gosh,
you.
that's
I know,
terrible. You guys, I should start singing this. I did set this to a tune, actually. I'm just kidding. It's Friday, karaoke night, right? Okay, so scenario 1 is if you have numeric effluent. Now remember, this is if your permit is reissued during the interim period of the study. So if you have numeric effluent limits and C. dubia is the most sensitive species, and you have done the species sensitivity screening and C. dubia is the most sensitive species again, then you will continue to have numeric effluent limits based on C. dubia. That's the first scenario. If, on the other hand, your most sensitive species has changed from C. dubia to some other species, algae or fish, then you would have the effluent limitations based on that other new most sensitive species. You would continue to have effluent limits for some other species. You wouldn't do C. dubia. I've got some confused looks on our faces, and so want to stop here and make sure that we're clear on this.
So I'm personally finding this in the subsequent tables confusing because, and I understand this is all about Cereodaphnia per issue 3 or whatever on the previous slides, but right, 4 cereals. Right, but the first column, permit requirements, C. dubia is the most sensitive species. Second column, most sensitive species, 2 options. Why wouldn't this just say numeric effluent limits on the left-hand side, and if you have Cereo, it's going to be this. If you don't have Cereo, it's going to be that. I'm confused, because the next table makes it even more confusing to me.
Okay, so the idea here is this is your permit requirements now. This is your current permit requirements. Next column is your new permit that's issued during the interim period. You've done a species sensitivity screening and you have 2 possible answers to that, either C. dubia or some other species. In both cases, in this instance, you'll continue to have numeric effluent limitations, either for C. dubia, if that's your most sensitive species, or another species. Make sense? All right. Was that clearing up everybody's furrowed brows?
Okay, so it really had to do with the numeric effluent limits. Are you talking about ones that already have numerics based upon TST? Are you talking about that there is a numeric trigger as an effluent limit? Oh, okay. Okay, that's different than number. No, but it's effluent numeric trigger. It's an effluent limit with a numeric trigger.
Hold on, we have multiple people. Yeah.
I think I have two questions. The first being, since these are effluent limitations based upon a new water quality objective, do the effluent limitations require to be carried forward? This being a new objective, the effluent limitations and permits are based upon the narrative toxicity objective, whereas these are new objectives. And so do you have to carry forward the effluent limitations in the same manner for those species, given that it's a new objective?
I don't understand your question, nor do I understand your nope, do not.
So the current effluent limitations that are put into permits and triggers, et cetera, are based upon the narrative toxicity objective, interpreting the narrative toxicity objective.
That's right.
So the policy is going to adopt and put into place
Objectives.
new objectives. So, but that leaves in place the narrative toxicity objective from which the current effluent limitations are being put into
We're
permits.
going to get new effluent limitations here.
Based upon a new objective, though.
This will be new effluent limitations based on the current provisions as you read them.
Right.
In both cases. Based on the numeric water quality objectives in the provisions.
Okay.
Well, we're not superseding the narrative objectives for a number of different reasons, but the intent is for aquatic toxicity, the numeric water quality objectives are what you would use. You would not be interpreting a narrative, I think is the question you're asking me. It's just like copper. You don't interpret the narrative objective if you have a numeric water quality objective in the basin plan for copper. You use the copper number.
Gotcha.
Okay?
Yes. Well, just in this case, being based upon a new numeric objective, my question is, I guess I'm assuming that the effluent limitations would carry forward in the permit, in these permits and these permits alone, based upon anti-backsliding requirements. Is that?
We are not
If
wanting to make less stringent the
Right.
permits that are currently in place.
Okay.
Is that an okay thing to say?
So, I want to make sure you understand the new effluent limitations are actually specified in the draft provisions, first of all. And then for permits that already have numeric effluent limitations, we will have to evaluate whether there's backsliding, and if there is backsliding, whether any of the exceptions apply. We're definitely going to be complying with the anti-backsliding requirements where they apply. I don't think we've actually gone through the effort to evaluate all of the various existing effluent limitations to see what exactly we'll have to do. But definitely the intention is, unless we can't, to use the new spelled out effluent limitations in the draft plan. Does that make sense?
But you have to run through a reasonable potential analysis with the new objective. So there may be situations where you had reasonable potential under the narrative for some reason, and now you don't, and you wouldn't have to have an effluent limit at all.
Yeah, that's conceivable. We'll definitely look. I mean, the permit writers will be having to apply the rules when they renew the permits, and so it may well depend upon whether there was reasonable potential in the past and whether there is in the future. This is all assuming, though, this one scenario is assuming that there is an obligation to put in an effluent limitation in the first place.
It's just not clear.
Yeah, no, we're being a little, I mean, we're trying to, yeah. it'll need to be clear when we write it in the provisions, that's for sure. We're being a little shorthand, making some assumptions so that we can clearly figure out where you would land depending on the scenario that you're currently under. So go ahead.
And
Ann.
just so we're all totally clear, when you say numeric effluent limit, that could be a NOAC 1.0 TUC. That would count as a numeric effluent limit that would put you in this page.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. We've got a couple other scenarios. We ready to move on? All right. Scenario number 2 is your current permit requirements have numeric effluent limits based, but Cereodaphnia is not the most sensitive species. So this one's a little trickier. We wrestled with what we proposed. This was not something we contemplated at the workshop. So this is something we know we have to deal with because this exists, but we didn't talk about this. So this is probably new to most everybody in here. So then you do your reasonable potential analysis, you do your species sensitivity screening, and in your permit reissuance, C. dubia is the most sensitive species. So we actually have a couple of options proposed here that you would get effluent limitations, same as what the provisions are for C. dubia, or effluent limitations for the second most sensitive species, but the C. dubia would be implemented as a monitoring trigger that would be applied in the same way as the way that effluent limitations are, but wouldn't result in a violation. So we haven't really landed on anything there and would be interested in knowing what your thoughts would be on that. If your most sensitive species is not C. dubia, this one's easy. You'd get the effluent limitations for that species based on the provisions. So where we'd like some thoughts and input is kind of what you think we should do under this scenario where you don't have C. dubia now, so you have algae, and now C. dubia is your most sensitive species. What do we do? And our thought is that we still need numeric effluent limitations for whole effluent toxicity. And so do we apply C. dubia in this instance? Do we do C. dubia as a trigger and use the second most sensitive species, which of course requires more testing, more cost? So wanted to get your input on this one.
There's a third option, which you probably intentionally left out, probably. And that is you don't currently have a numeric limit for C. dubia. We have a limit for some
We have
other-
we have that scenario.
No,
That's not this
I'm saying in this scenario, you currently do not have a limit for C. dubia, but you have one for whatever species is your most sensitive. And C. dubia becomes your most sensitive species during the interim period. You could also have option 3, which is like anybody else who doesn't have a limit on C. dubia, which is apply the MDEL and apply the MMEL as a trigger. And that, so I think there's a third choice unless there's some.
Oh, I see. So you're looking forward to where we don't have.
No, I'm saying
our
even
next
in this scenario, if you look at the
Right.
current permit requirement, because Cereodaphnia is not your most sensitive species, you do not have a numeric limit for Cereodaphnia. Only because it's not your most sensitive species, but you don't. If it should become your most sensitive species, then it's treated like any other permit that did not have a Cereodaphnia limit in it.
Right.
Which would be, you would have compliance with the MDEL.
And an MMET.
Yeah, MMET.
Yeah, that's certainly.
Unless there's some reason you left that off.
Well, the issue there is that you no longer have an MMEL. You no longer have the what we call a chronic, but it's not. It's a bit of a misnomer, but yeah. And again, we haven't done the evaluation of all potential permits. We just know these scenarios exist, but we haven't gone through and looked to see, what exactly. I mean, we know generally speaking which ones have TUs and which ones are using the TST and have similar effluent limits, but we haven't looked at every single permit. Go ahead, Ann.
So assuming that you throw out Phil's option 3, although that would be a very nice option, is there an option to allow the user to choose which of those 2 options they would like? Or the region or the board.
So
Well, not necessarily the board, but there'll be some people
Pick
that
your
will be-
storyline.
There'll be some people that are very tight on money, and they're like, look, I don't care if I get the violation. I don't want to spend money to run 2 tests. I'm just going to run my Serio. Give me the limit. Fine. And there's going to be people that don't want that Serio limit and are willing to open up their wallet and say, I don't want that Serio limit. I'm willing to have the fat head. I'm going to run both the fat heads and the Serios. We'll do compliance on the fat heads. I don't care. I got big pockets. I'm going to run those Serios. So I think there's going to be different people with different priorities that might want of those options. So an option to do either one of those 2 might be the most palatable to everybody.
That's a thought. Pick your poison. Any other thoughts on that? And we got those suggestions in the notes, right? So. And not use the provisions at all? Sure. I mean, yeah, I suppose that's an option. Other thoughts before I move on to the next scenario? They get a little bit more complicated as we go further. Yes, please.
I just want to clarify with these scenarios, is the kind of the overriding factor trying to figure out what to do in each scenario with regards to dealing with the anti-backsliding issue, actually having to dig into the permits, what the requirements are now. I guess, so that's one thing. And then big picture, can option 3 just be applied in each scenario if the anti-backsliding requirements can be met, complied with? Does that make sense?
So the answer to the first question is no. These scenarios were not designed to deal with anti-backsliding. They were an outgrowth of the workshop where it was suggested that if a permittee already had a numeric effluent limitation for C. dubia, that maybe it'd be appropriate to have them continue to have that effluent limitation. So then we got into various scenarios where, sort of twists on that set of facts. That's what this is really for. And now I've lost track of your second question.
Can option 3 be applied to each scenario?
Option 3 being an MDEL and an MMET. So in other words, we have the MDEL for Serio and the trigger for the MMEL instead of a...
So I'm thinking, sorry, I don't have all the scenarios in front of me. For each scenario or just for this scenario?
For scenario 1 and 2, particularly thinking 1 because option 3 was not listed under scenario 1, can option 3 be applied to scenario 1? So it provides overriding consistency throughout all the scenarios rather than having to have a number of different permitting pathways just because we're trying to deal with the effluent limitations that are already established for some permittees.
Well, in that case, let's just use the provisions across the board and not worry about this interim period. Maybe?
Yeah.
That's an option.
Yeah.
It's option 1. Yeah. I don't think we need to turn it off.
All right.
So my concern is anybody that has a numeric effluent limit that's a POTW currently is not consistent with state water board orders. There's 4 orders that say you're not supposed to have a numeric limit, you're supposed to have a narrative limit, and you're supposed to have a trigger. So anybody that has a numeric limit that's a POTW is inconsistent with state law. So those should not have to be maintained. And there's at least 12 petitions sitting out there that we've not gone to court on because we're trying to get this resolved, that have challenged those numeric effluent limits because they're inconsistent with state policy and in some cases inconsistent with TMDLs that tell you how to do your limits and they're wrong. So I don't know why anybody would be treated differently because they have a numeric limit. They should just be treated the same.
So you're making an argument for option 1.
No, well, that you would have a trigger. It's a trigger until we get the study done for everybody. You get the MDEL, which we've conceded on, and you get the MMET for Cereodaphnia or whatever your critter is, and that should be the rule until we get the study done.
And that is option.
But that only applies to
2.
people that...
No, it was an option that was considered. This is option 4. Let's just all agree that these all are still under consideration. All of these. Option 4 is just recognizing that there are different scenarios. We got some suggestions from stakeholders at the August workshop were around, well, why don't we just comply with our permit that we have now? We're willing to do that during the interim period. But we recognize that's not everybody. So we're just trying to do a compromise here. We can certainly recommend to our board, we're not doing anything different. Let's just comply with what you're going to adopt, whatever that is, and go with option 1. And that's a whole lot simpler than all of these potential scenarios, that's for sure. So, recognizing that this is intended to be a compromise, intended to try to figure out a way to thread a needle here, let's move on to the 3rd scenario, unless there are other questions on this one. Okay, sounds good, thanks. All right, so the 3rd scenario is where your current permit doesn't have numeric effluent limits. It has triggers based on the narrative that are monitoring triggers. They do not result in violations, right? This is you. This is your scenario. No, I said it was it's an upcoming scenario, and this is it. I think you were describing, what if your permit has a trigger that requires you to do monitoring based on the narrative? But it doesn't result in a violation only if you don't do your monitoring, right? It's not a numeric limit in the terms of actually having a violation based on the TUs of the trigger. You then do monitoring, and you have to do additional accelerated monitoring and a TRE and all of that. If you don't do that, then you have a violation. But if you violate the trigger, you don't get a violation. Right. So that's the difference between a trigger and an effluent limit.
The general order that was adopted in Region 5 for the people that, right here. So that may be a different scenario than the one you're describing. But this is the one that's kind of the common interpretation of the narrative out of the CTR, the SIP approach.
Okay, so we might have another scenario.
Yeah, Karen, I'm pretty sure, back here. I'm pretty sure that the general permit issued by the Central Valley Board does not have a numeric effluent limitation for whole effluent toxicity. If they use the word trigger at all, that's not a effluent limitation that's enforceable, like the ones we're talking about here? Okay.
Okay, so this is, we think that this is the scenario. And so you have a trigger. If your permit is being reissued and C. dubia is the most sensitive species, then you will get the maximum daily effluent limitation per the provisions, but the MMEL will be a trigger rather than an effluent limitation. If it's another species is your most sensitive species, then you have effluent limits based on the provisions. And I think that was actually contemplated at the August meeting, that was clearly characterized there. Do we have another? Oh, thank God. I thought we had another scenario. Questions on this one? The real tricky one was the one that wasn't contemplated in August. It's this one. And as you can see, we haven't landed on a recommendation yet on this one. So we've taken your input. If you have additional input, happy to hear it right here.
Sorry, can we, Jacob, can you give him the microphone?
You need a
Thank
microphone.
you.
What I was intending to communicate earlier is just on this last scenario, which is scenario 3.
Wait,
Next slide.
this one?
Yeah, the top right white box, the MDEL, yes, being applied to each scenario.
Yes,
So that was, I just wanted to clarify.
I understood
Okay,
that
thanks.
to be what you were explaining. Yes. Other questions, comments? Caitlin, do you want to make a comment?
I guess, I don't know, just trying to get back to what you were saying with the additional option 3 trigger, of applying that across all 3 scenarios. I guess, just a kind of comment questions, thinking, get back to backsliding when we're looking at option 1. If there's a numeric effluent already in place and you're now imposing a trigger, that's just, off the top of my head, that just makes me wonder if that is even possible to apply under scenario 1. So I know we already discussed it, but I'm just saying I know your team's already looking into that. And then the inconsistency piece, I mean, that's why we have option 4, is that there are these different scenarios. So of course we're looking at maybe that inconsistent application, but just as a general comment, heard me already speak during the October workshop, but having that, the MMEL compliance piece means critical to the integrity of these provisions. So I mean, it's something across the board, just as a comment, that regardless of the scenario, that it's well integrated here. I think even if it's a trigger, not effluent limitation, but the fact you can't let that piece go. So just, again, commenting on that option 3 piece, just I'm glad to see that that's still maintained. MMEL compliance. Just the last comment, just of course would love to see that consistency. Really, it's the option 1, that consistent use of the provisions across the board, but that's just my commentary.
Thank you. Others?
Well, mine's just more of a question on, I mean, ultimately, I guess EPA is going to need to bless it and accept it. Are they involved with sort of helping with these scenarios at this point? Or
Yeah, we're in discussions to make sure
so
that whatever we propose, they can approve.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I just remember that.
Not to worry. Yeah. I don't want to go through the back bending and go, oh, sorry, can't do it.
So speaking of EPA, at several hearings and workshops, you've talked about the need for an ATP to be able to do some of this. Is there an ATP that's proposed, or when is that going to be sent to EPA?
So we don't need an ATP to do any of the stuff we're proposing in the provisions or in these scenarios. We want to do an alternative test procedure, to allow for single concentration versus a control to be the only samples tested. to reduce the number of samples that are required to be tested. Now, that doesn't mean people can't continue to do the dilution series, but our hope is to be able to reduce the cost of compliance by allowing that to be done. But we don't have to have that approved in order to move forward with our provisions.
So the state's opinion is still that even though it's not in the table in the regulations, it's only NOAC and EC 25% effect that you can still do TST.
That's correct.
Just a question, sorry about that, as we're just clarifying, and apologies if this came up earlier, but I'm just curious going back to, I mean, the point of option 4 is the delay of the inclusion of the MMEL until a certain date. I'm curious to know what that date is as these permits are reissued and reopened during the study. We haven't discussed if that then means at the end of the study that then the provisions would then go in place, or what does that actually look like?
Thanks for that question. So earlier when we talked about the study, we said 2023. Our intent, and again, none of this has been approved by our board yet, but our intent is at 2023, the provisions go in place as written for everyone. And for the ones that have the deferred MMEL, we're contemplating that the permits need to be written in a way that they convert from an MMET, if that's what we end up choosing to go to an MMEL at that point. I'm not sure if that's a question or just.
Where's my drink?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I just, on this last scenario, sorry, I know I'm jumping a little bit around, but I did want to go back to one of the things that we are hoping with our smaller communities. And with the TRE costs and the different provisions, this has been extremely problematic, especially with this species. And so that second half of that, the idea of continuing to use a trigger was one of those ones that we looked at and said, for the smaller communities, that still is problematic. And having the results of the study where we have what we hope to have greater confidence in the results is we think a prudent way of moving forward prior to spending a lot of cost on TREs, especially for those very low level effects.
I know we're meeting in December. Something would be helpful to know is how many permits are up for renewal between now and 2023 for your small communities. Just note that in your mind.
Just the way you described it as automatically being reincorporated at that date, I think a little bit concerning because it kind of presupposes that the study will turn out wonderfully and that, everything will just kind of kick back in. I think we had proposed that it be more of a decision point at the end of that study, at which point, if the board decides that that's the appropriate course of action is to revert everyone to that standard, then that would be the appropriate juncture to do that. But in terms of it automatically happening at a particular date, regardless of where you're at with the study or regardless of the results of the study, would be concerning.
So,
yeah, a board check-in or a board decision.
Well, we're certainly going to report back to the board. That goes to my first bullet of the first slide of what the study is not, which is throwing out Cereodaphnia at the end of it. So, yes, we're not presupposing that what the findings will be, but we're also not throwing out Cereodaphnia and don't intend to. And we've been instructed to make sure that we're not 16 years from now still trying to determine whether Cereodaphnia is appropriate or not. We think it's appropriate. We think we can do a study to improve the method implementation, and that's the plan.
Yes, I suppose, so if there are things that are identified related to method implementation, or if we are able to find a point of it with a number of not false positive, but false indications of toxicity rate, I mean, those things I would imagine would have to be incorporated in some way into the provisions or in some other method before it just automatically kicks in for everyone. I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at, is there may need to be other things that need to be done before it just automatically reverts to this is the policy as is today.
So let me just say, we've got a lot of evidence to show that this is a robust test and people can do it. And the TST is working. I mean, it would be throwing that analysis completely out the door to not. There's a lot of information to show that this is a robust test. So I don't think our 3-year or 1-year study with 12 labs is going to recommend that Cereodaphnia is not a good test to be doing for regulatory purposes.
I mean, I think I understand that what you're saying is that should every single blank study every single blank sample in the toxic have 100% effect in the Cereodaphnia test, and all the work that could be done fails to reduce that at all, wouldn't change your mind about the reliability and the usability of this test. And that's why it really doesn't matter, whatever, April 15th, 2023, you're going to implement it as written. I think I'm paraphrasing, or I'm probably summarizing, but
Well,
is
let's
that true?
hope. I mean,
if we can improve it, improvement's always a good thing. Doesn't matter how good something is. If we can make it better, that's great. But you know what? Even if every single sample comes back identified wrong, doesn't matter. It's still good enough.
well, so let's think about what we're really measuring, and it's a lab control versus a sample. We're not measuring whether your lab thinks that the other lab's lab control is toxic to your cerio. That's not the question we're asking when we're determining whether your effluent is toxic or not. It's comparing it to the control within your lab, the Cereodaphnia that are grown in your lab control. You've optimized it for your lab.
The idea of that lab control is not like I want to see how my lab control compares to some other lab's control. The idea is my lab controls an effluent. It's an unknown effluent to the laboratory that I send it to, but we know it's non-toxic. Are they finding it non-toxic as well? It's a surrogate for an effluent sample is what it is. It's just a surrogate that we happen to know for a fact is non-toxic.
We also know that Cereodaphnia get used to the conditions in which they are cultured. Right. Oh, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. Well, I'm not going to sit here and say that if every single blank sample is 100% toxic, that I'm going to dig my heels in and go, no, this is a good test. So we'll see what happens. And our board can decide at that point to change the provisions and go, we are not going to include Cereodaphnia in this table 1. I don't care what you say, Karen.
Well, in Karen, there is a middle ground. So, it may be at the end of the study that everyone says Cerio is fine, but it may be that we just have to tweak the limits a little bit to reflect issues that in the test. So if we do this study and we just can't get variability where we want it, you go back to the Fox paper, it's not 1 in 100 anymore. We have new numbers, it's 1 in 50 or 1 in 20, then maybe we just need to, we can still use Cerios, but maybe we just need to tweak how we're doing it a little bit. So that's where they're going. And that's why there's nervousness about, everything's just going to automatically take effect in 2023, because it may be that we come out and say, okay, well, let's just tweak this a little bit based on what we know right now.
That could be a scenario. Are we ready to move on? I went all the way back to there, so I got to keep going. Really, we're in the home stretch. We're in the final stretch. So this is our project timeline, which is a little squishy still, as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, which is we're going to be releasing the appendix. We're doing some tweaking to make it consistent, to define some of the false positives and be more clear as to what we mean by that. Was one issue that we ran into, and so wanted to make sure we're all singing from the same choir book. And then letting you all give us, tell us where we got it wrong. So, and again, it'll be likely more than a 30-day comment period. It'll probably be through January. We do plan to have a workshop. It looks like you can put this on your calendar, January 9th in the afternoon. Yeah. So it's not, we did contemplate the 6th, and I said, oh, none of these people are going to be thinking about this over New Year's. They're going to still be hungover. So we didn't do the Monday after New Year's. And so the 9th, we'll be going through the appendix in much more detail. And you'll have it in hand, so you'll be able to go, wait a minute, what the heck is that on page 20? It's not very long, by the way. It's probably less than 35 pages or something, I think, ultimately. Lots of figures and things of data that we analyzed. And then we're hoping not too long after the close of that comment period, and again, it may include parts of the provisions, depending on what our legal staff say once we get our final proposed changes we want to make. And then at that point, the whole staff report, including the new appendix, as well as the revisions to the provisions, will be released. And then that will be what's contemplated at the adoption hearing, hopefully sometime in the spring. The response to comments will be released along with the staff report and the revised provisions, because many of the responses are based on what the revisions are going to be, and we still aren't completely sure what that final is going to be yet. And then you guys probably have these phone numbers memorized at this point. We're hoping for as soon in December as possible, like the first couple of weeks. We're planning on internal review like right after Thanksgiving and trying to get it out quickly after that. Oh, you guys have ELAP regs. Oh, well, you don't have to look at it until after that. Well, no, January. I said you're going to have till the end of January. So just plan on that, pencil yourself in for January. For 30-something pages. It's not 300 or 90,000. Is the 90,000 is something on the order of the EIR for the Bay Delta, for the tunnels or something like that? 90,000 pages or something? My God. I'm glad I'm not that consultant. That is true. And we appreciate it. They were very good. And we came up with some good revisions as a result. We listened. So, yeah, Ann.
Can we back up to a question that I have on the Fox memo, because we weren't really asking questions as you went back then, so I didn't really have a chance to ask a question. I know, sorry.
I thought it was done, Ann.
Oh, it's so close, so close.
Golly, it is. It's Friday, right?
I do know it's Friday, yes. Okay, so Fox, we haven't seen the memo yet, and if you're going to give us a chance to comment on the memo. The 1 in 500 is a little surprising to us. So was that based on a certain level of performance for the labs?
Oh, yes. Yeah,
And that
we had to pick a
performance
CV
was-
of 0.15 or something.
Was it
Is that right?
and where does that
I'm
rank?
getting this
That's
stuff.
the 50th. That's the
50th for
50th
national.
percentile nationally.
Yeah, so it's an average performance, yes.
Half the time people are going to be above, worse than that, and half the time better.
And then did the Fox memo include looking at the 10th percent, 90th percentile labs? No.
This probability memo is very short, and we asked them a very specific question, and they did look at just the median.
And this is strictly looking at calling a 10% effect or less toxic.
Yes.
Oh, well, that's kind of useless, isn't it?
Well, that's
okay.
how they
All right.
define it.
Well, that's reflected.
All right. Anything else for the good of the order? Any other zingers for me? A song. I can sing a song. Who wants to hear a song? Just kidding. Now I'm blushing. I can feel it in my cheeks. All right. Well, thank you very much for your attention and coming. And again, January 9th, workshop on the appendix. And we'll make sure this, obviously, you'll all get the appendix when it comes out for your review. So thanks.